On Thanksgiving, my son-in-law pointed at my wheelchair during dinner. "Stop making noise every time you move," he sneered. My daughter stayed silent. Then he wheeled me into a dark storage room and locked the door. "Stay here until we finish," he said. The whole table carried on eating without me. I quietly took out my phone and dialed a familiar number. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. He listened for 10 seconds, then rushed to open the door, begging me for mercy. "I am so grateful you're spending time with Dad's revenge stories. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment telling me your city and country. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to existing names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is useful. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table when something unforgivable has just happened. Not the silence of people thinking. The silence of people deciding whether to pretend they didn't see it. I know that silence now. I have replayed it more times than I can count. It was Thanksgiving evening, the 23rd of November, 2023. The kind of cold Tennessee night where the heat inside a house feels almost deliberate, like the warmth itself is performing for the people gathered under the roof. My daughter Emily had set the table for 16. There were candles in the center. There was a turkey that had been cooking since morning. There were people I had known for decades seated around that table, passing rolls and talking over each other, the way families do when they are more comfortable with noise than with honesty. I had been seated at the far end of the table near the corner, where the wheelchair fit without blocking the walkway. Emily had placed me there. She hadn't asked if I minded. She had simply pointed the way you point at where a piece of furniture should go, and I had wheeled myself into position without comment. I had been doing that for a long time by then fitting myself into the spaces other people designated for me. The evening had started the way those evenings always did. My son-in-law, Daniel Marsh, stood at the head of the table carving the turkey with the slow confidence of a man who believed every room he entered was waiting for him. He had built that image carefully over years. I knew better than most what it had actually cost to build it and who had paid. My daughter sat to his left, her hair done the way she only did it when people were coming over. Her smile fixed in the particular way of a woman managing the impression the evening was making on everyone in the room. She laughed at the right moments. She refilled glasses before anyone asked. She was very good at the performance. She had been practicing it for years. My sister Maggie sat across the table from Emily. She caught my eye once during the soup course and held it for just a second longer than a casual glance would require. Maggie had always been the one in our family who noticed things that went unspoken. She noticed them and carried them quietly the way certain people do, because they understand that naming a thing out loud can sometimes make it worse before it makes it better. My grandson Carter sat 3 seats down from me. He was 16 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's habit of watching a room more than participating in it. He had been quieter than usual all evening. I had noticed. I filed it away. It was during the main course that it happened. I had reached for the water pitcher at the center of the table. My arm is steady enough for most things, but the pitcher was just beyond a comfortable stretch, and I shifted forward in the chair to reach it. The chair moved slightly against the hardwood floor. That was all. A small sound. A minor adjustment. Daniel set down his fork. "Richard." His voice came out flat and deliberate the way a man speaks when he has been waiting for a reason to speak that way. "Do you have to make that noise every time you move?" The table did not go silent immediately. It thinned conversation, dropping away in sections like lights going out in a building one floor at a time. "I was reaching for the water," I said. I kept my voice level. I had a great deal of practice keeping my voice level around Daniel. There's always something with you, he said. He said it to the table more than to me, with a small shake of his head, inviting the room to agree with him. Every dinner, every holiday, something. Emily set her wine glass down. She looked at the centerpiece, not at me, not at Daniel. At the centerpiece. 3 white candles in a wreath of dried orange slices. She studied it as though it contained instructions. Daniel stood up. He walked the length of the table without rushing. The conversations that had been trailing off stopped entirely. He came around behind my chair and wrapped both hands around the push handles, the ones I never asked anyone to use because I had been moving myself for 15 years without assistance. "You'll be more comfortable somewhere quieter," he said. He said it the way you say something to a child you are removing from a situation. Gently enough to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Daniel. My voice came out the same as before. Flat. Controlled. The voice I had developed over years of absorbing things that should have broken me. He pushed the chair anyway. "I want you to understand what happened next, because the details matter." He wheeled me out of the dining room, through the kitchen, and to the door of the storage room at the back of the house. It was a small room, roughly 8 feet by 10, that held the things families accumulate and never discard: boxes of Christmas decorations, an old vacuum cleaner, a recycling bin that smelled of cardboard and dust. There was no chair in that room other than the one I was sitting in. There was no light except what came in from the kitchen before he reached past me and pulled the door most of the way closed. "Stay here until we're done," Daniel said. "I'll have someone bring you a plate." Then the door closed. I sat in the near dark and listened to the sound of 16 people resuming a Thanksgiving dinner without me. I heard someone laugh, a high, bright sound that carried easily through walls. I heard the clink of a serving spoon against a ceramic bowl. I heard my daughter's voice, clear and unhurried, pick up a sentence she had apparently left unfinished. She did not come to the door. I reached into the left breast pocket of my cardigan. I had kept the same kind of cardigan for 20 years, the kind with a chest pocket large enough to hold a phone without pulling the fabric out of shape. My phone was there. I took it out. The screen lit up in the dark, and I found the number I was looking for without scrolling. I had known it by heart for 4 years. Some numbers you memorize because you call them often. Some you memorize because you always knew the day would come when you would need them without time to search. I pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. "Patricia," I said. "It's time. Activate everything." There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "Understood," she said. "It's done." I ended the call. I set the phone face down on my knee and sat quietly in the dark storage room of a house that had my name on the deed at a dinner I had funded for 16 years, surrounded by a silence that had taken me a long time to stop trying to fill. I was not angry. That surprised people later when I told them this part of the story. They expected anger or grief or the particular humiliation of a man who has just been wheeled into a closet by his son-in-law in front of his entire family. What I felt was something closer to clarity. I had been waiting for Daniel Marsh to show me exactly who he was in front of witnesses. He had just done it. And 5 minutes from now, his phone was going to ring, and everything he had built on the foundation of my patience was going to begin coming apart. I sat in the dark, and I waited. The phone rang 4 minutes and 53 seconds after I ended my call with Patricia. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on my screen in the dark, counting. Not out of impatience. Out of the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent 4 years preparing for a moment and wants to experience every second of it arriving on schedule. I heard Daniel's ringtone through the wall. He had it set to something that sounded like a sports broadcast notification, sharp, percussive, the kind of sound that announced importance. I heard the ringtone cut off when he answered. I heard his voice shift from the warm, commanding register he used at the dinner table to something flatter and more careful. Then I heard him push back his chair. Through the gap at the bottom of the storage room door, I could see the kitchen light. I watched his shadow cross it as he walked away from the dining room toward the back of the house. Toward me, though, he didn't know that yet. He stopped in the kitchen. I could hear him clearly through the door. "What do you mean, suspended?" A pause. "No, that account is—" Another pause, longer. "Who authorized that?" I had authorized it. 4 years ago, when I first signed the personal guarantee agreement with First Tennessee Bank on Daniel's behalf. Patricia had insisted on a specific clause buried in paragraph 14 of the contract. A personal guarantee, she explained, is a legal promise in which one person, in this case me, agrees to repay a debt if the borrower defaults or if certain conditions are breached. The clause Patricia insisted on stated that I, as the guarantor, retained the right to withdraw that guarantee with 30 days. Written notice under specific circumstances that included documented evidence of financial misrepresentation or breach of the relationship of trust that formed the basis of the guarantee. For 4 years I had been building that documentation. 30 days ago I had mailed her the letter that started the clock. The 30 days was up at midnight tonight. "There has to be a mistake," Daniel said into his phone. His voice had dropped to the register men use when they are frightened and trying not to show it. "Call your supervisor. Call whoever you need to call. This doesn't just happen." It did, in fact, just happen. I heard him end the call. Then I heard him make another one. I heard him say Patricia's name like a question, the way you say the name of someone you have underestimated and are only now beginning to take seriously. I heard Patricia's assistant tell him she was unavailable. I heard him ask when she would be available. I heard the answer land. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after that. I could hear him breathing through the door, then he walked back toward the dining room. I heard him speak to Emily in a low voice, the kind that carries urgency without wanting to be overheard. I heard Emily say, "What?" and then say it again, differently. The second time, her voice carried a thread of something that was not quite alarm, but was moving in that direction. I had known Daniel Marsh for 10 years. In that time, I had watched him build a version of himself that required an audience to hold its shape. He was the kind of man who needed people to believe he had done it alone. The self-made narrative was not incidental to Daniel, it was structural. Without it, there was nothing holding the rest of him upright. What he had never understood, because he had never bothered to look carefully at the numbers behind his own success, was that there was no alone. There had never been an alone. In the spring of 2014, Daniel's first business venture, a commercial property management company, he had launched 18 months earlier, was 4 weeks from insolvency. He came to me on a Sunday afternoon, sitting across from me in the living room of a house I had owned since before Emily was born, and told me he needed $340,000 to cover a debt that had come due faster than he expected. He did not say please. He framed it as a temporary measure. He said he would pay it back within 2 years. I wrote the check that afternoon. He paid back $40,000 of it over the following 3 years. He never mentioned the remaining $300,000 again, and I never asked, because by then I understood that asking would require him to acknowledge what he had received, and Daniel was constitutionally unable to acknowledge receiving anything from anyone. 2 years later, in 2016, he needed more. This time it was a loan from the bank, $520,000 to expand into a second market. The bank required a personal guarantor with sufficient assets. Daniel had none that weren't already leveraged. He asked me to sign. A personal guarantee of that size meant that if Daniel failed to repay the loan, the bank could come after my assets directly, my savings, my investment accounts, the property I owned. It was not a small ask. Patricia advised me against it. I signed anyway because Emily was sitting next to Daniel on the couch when he asked, and she looked at me with the expression I had been trying to earn back since the accident, and I told myself that was a reason. It was not a reason. It was a habit dressed up as love. And then in 2018, I bought the house. $480,000 cash for a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood east of Nashville that Emily had been talking about for 2 years. I put it in my name because Patricia told me to. Daniel had wanted his name on the deed. Patricia had looked at me across her desk and said very quietly, "Don't." I didn't. Daniel never forgave me for that. He never said so directly, but I could feel it in the way he talked about the house at dinner parties, always our home, never Richard's house, as though repetition could change the title on the document. Standing in the kitchen 4 minutes after Patricia had activated the recall clause and frozen the credit line connected to my guarantee, Daniel Marsh was learning one phone call at a time that the foundation he had built his confidence on belonged to someone else. Every loan, every guarantee, every safety net he had mistaken for his own competence had my signature on it. I heard him come back to the storage room door. He opened it slowly, the way a person opens something when they're not sure what they'll find on the other side. The kitchen light fell across the floor and reached my wheels. He looked at me. His face had changed. The performance had slipped not entirely, but enough. Underneath it was something I had not seen on Daniel Marsh's face in 10 years of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties and Sunday afternoons in the living room, where I had once written him a check for $340,000 without being asked to say please. He looked uncertain. "We need to talk," he said. I looked back at him from the dark storage room of a house with my name on the deed in a wheelchair he had put me in at the end of a dinner he had eaten on money I had quietly supplied for a decade. "I know," I said. "We do. I told Daniel we would talk. Then I asked him to give me a few minutes alone first." He looked at me with the uncertain expression of a man who had just lost the ability to say no to someone he had spent years dismissing, and he pulled the storage room door mostly closed behind him without another word. I sat in the dark, and I let the memory come. I had been holding it at arm's length all evening, sitting in that small room in the house I had bought with my own money in the chair I had been living in for 15 years. I finally let it in. It was a Tuesday night in November of 2008. Emily was 23 years old. She had called me at 9:30 to ask if I wanted to ride with her out to her friend's place in Brentwood, a birthday dinner she had forgotten about until an hour before. Her car was in the shop. Could I drive? I could always drive. That was the answer I always gave her. We took my truck. Emily drove because I had pulled something in my shoulder that afternoon, moving boxes in the garage, and she insisted. She was a careful driver in good conditions. The conditions that night were not good. It had been raining since mid-afternoon, the kind of steady Tennessee rain that makes the roads look deceptively dry under headlights until you brake and discover they are not. We were heading south on Interstate 65 when it happened. Emily was telling me something about her friend, a story about a promotion. I think, though I cannot recall the details now, and I suspect I could not recall them clearly even the next morning. What I remember is the sound the tires made when they lost contact with the road surface. A particular absence of friction, like the world briefly withdrawing its cooperation. Emily said, "Dad," and her voice carried in that single syllable every version of fear a person can feel at once. The truck went sideways. The guardrail on the passenger side came up fast, and I had perhaps 1 second of clear perception before everything became motion and noise. In that second, I understood two things simultaneously. The first was that the truck was going to roll. The second was that Emily was on the wrong side of it. I do not remember making a decision. I remember my hand finding the door handle on her side. I remember pulling. I remember the ground coming up to meet me with a force that removed everything else from my awareness for a period of time I still cannot accurately estimate. I woke up looking at rain. The sky above me was dark and wet, and a highway patrol officer was saying my name with the careful repetition of someone who is not sure the person they are talking to can hear them. I could hear him perfectly. I simply could not respond yet because my body was conducting an inventory of itself, and the results were not encouraging. Emily was standing 10 feet away, wrapped in a reflective blanket, shaking from the cold, or from shock, or from both. She was not injured. She had a scrape on her left palm where she had caught herself on the asphalt, and her jeans were torn at the knee, and she was completely, entirely, miraculously unharmed in any way that would leave a permanent mark. I watched her from the ground and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. The paramedics told me later that the impact had compressed 3 vertebrae in my lower back and partially severed the spinal cord at the 10th thoracic level. They used clinical language because clinical language is the kindest way to tell a person something that cannot be untold. What it meant in practical terms was that I would not walk again. Not across a room, not down a hallway, not anywhere. I spent 11 days in Vanderbilt University Medical Center before they transferred me to the rehabilitation unit. On the 4th day, when I had been moved out of the ICU and into a regular room, Emily came in and sat beside the bed and took my hand in both of hers. Her hands were warm. Mine were still numb in places where the nerves were trying to remember themselves. She was crying before she said a word. "Dad," she said. "Dad, I am so sorry. I am so sorry." She pressed her forehead down against the back of my hand, and her shoulders shook with the kind of crying that doesn't make much sound because it is coming from somewhere too deep for sound to carry easily. This is my fault. It was my fault, and I know it, and I am so sorry. Emily. I said her name the way I had said it since she was an infant, 2 syllables that contained everything I had ever felt about her existence in the world. "Look at me." She lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen and red and completely unguarded in the way eyes only get when a person has stopped managing how they appear to other people. "You are not hurt," I said. "That's the only thing that matters to me right now. That is the only thing. But you—" Her voice broke apart on the word. "I am here," I said. "I am right here. And we are going to figure out everything else together." She stayed for 6 hours that afternoon. When visiting hours ended and a nurse came to tell her gently that she needed to go, Emily stood up and held my hand for another full minute before releasing it. At the door, she turned back. "I promise you," she said. Her voice had steadied into something that sounded like a decision being made in real time. "I promise you, Dad. Whatever you need, whatever it takes, I will be there for every single part of this. You gave up everything for me that night, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." I believed her. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to what came later. I did not half believe her. I did not believe her with reservations or qualifications. I believed her the way you believe something that is being said by a person who is telling you the truest thing they have ever said in the most sincere moment of their life. She meant it. I am still certain of that. She meant every word of it, standing in that doorway on the 4th day of November in 2008. What I did not know, sitting in the dark of that storage room 15 years later, listening to the sounds of a Thanksgiving dinner winding down without me, was how long a promise could hold its shape before the person who made it stopped recognizing it as their own. Outside the storage room door, I heard Daniel's footsteps cross the kitchen again. I put the memory away. I straightened in the chair, and I reached for the door handle myself from the inside and pushed it open. When I pushed open the storage room door and rolled out into the kitchen, the dinner party had reached the stage where people were scraping plates and looking for reasons to leave. The candles on the table had burned down by a third. Someone had put on low music in the den, something with a piano faint enough to suggest atmosphere without demanding attention. 16 people were navigating the particular awkwardness of a family gathering that had gone wrong in a way no one wanted to be the first to name. Daniel was standing near the kitchen island with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen with the expression of a man reading a document. He does not fully understand, but understands enough to know he is in serious trouble. He looked up when he heard my wheels on the tile. He started to say something. "Not yet," I said. "Give me a minute with my sister." He closed his mouth. That more than anything else that had happened that evening told me how completely the balance had shifted. 3 hours ago, Daniel Marsh would not have closed his mouth on my request. He would have told me what we were doing and when. Maggie was in the dining room, the last one still seated at the table. She had a cup of coffee in front of her that she was not drinking, and she was sitting with the stillness of a woman who has decided to wait something out. My sister was 71 years old and had the posture of someone 20 years younger and the patience of someone 100 years older. She had driven up from Knoxville that morning 4 hours in her Buick because she came every Thanksgiving without fail and had for 30 years. She looked at me when I came through the doorway. Her eyes moved from my face to the direction I had come from and back to my face. "You were in the storage room," she said. It was not a question. I was. For how long? Long enough. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I should have said something when he took you back there. I want you to know I understand that. Maggie, I am telling you because I need to say it, not because I need you to respond to it." Her jaw was tight. She was angry not at me, and not the loose, performative anger people display when they want credit for caring. The quiet, compressed kind that takes up residence in the chest and stays there. He had no right. Nobody at that table had any right to let that happen and do nothing. "No," I agreed. "They didn't." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you remember the summer Emily was 9? I did. But I let Maggie tell it because she needed to, and because there are some memories that carry more weight when someone else confirms they also saw them. "The Patterson's boy," she said. "Marcus Patterson. He was 11, 12 maybe. He and his friends was out front and they started in on you about the truck. You'd just gotten that old Ford, the one with the dent in the quarter panel, and you hadn't had it fixed yet. Marcus said something about how only poor people drove trucks that looked like that. I remembered the truck. I remembered the dent. I remembered standing in the driveway on a Saturday morning in July, and I remembered the way the heat came off the asphalt in visible waves. Emily was on the porch," Maggie continued. "She heard every word, and before you could say anything, before you even turned around, she was off that porch. She went straight at that boy. She was 9 years old and probably 60 pounds, and she shoved him hard enough that he stumbled back into his friends. And she said—" Maggie stopped. Her voice had caught on something. She cleared it. She said, Don't you ever talk about my dad like that. Don't you ever. My dad is worth more than your whole street and everyone on it. The memory landed in my chest the way it always did. Not gently. Marcus Patterson was bigger than her by a foot, I said. Didn't matter to her one bit. Maggie set her coffee cup down carefully. That little girl did not calculate the odds before she got off that porch. She just went. Because someone had said something about you, and that was simply not acceptable to her. I looked toward the hallway where Emily had disappeared sometime in the last 20 minutes. I had watched her slip out of the dining room while Daniel was on his phone, not quite fleeing, but moving with the purposeful vagueness of someone who does not want to be asked where they are going. The distance between the 9-year-old who left a porch without calculating the odds and the 38-year-old who had studied a centerpiece while her husband wheeled her father into a storage room was not a distance I could measure in years. Years were not the right unit. It was a distance measured in choices, small ones, mostly the kind that don't feel significant when you make them, and only reveal their cumulative weight much later. I had watched those choices happen in real time and told myself they were phases, adjustments, the natural recalibration of a daughter building her own life. I had told myself that the version of Emily who shoved Marcus Patterson off his feet was still in there underneath the dinner parties and the curated social media posts and the careful management of what everyone in her orbit was allowed to see. I was not certain of that anymore. Where did she go? Maggie asked. I don't know, I said, but I know she heard everything that happened tonight. Hearing and doing something about it are different activities. Maggie's voice was dry and precise, the voice of a woman who had spent 7 decades watching people confuse the two. She's always been better at the first one than the second. That was true. And it was also true that I had spent 15 years making it easy for Emily to hear things and do nothing about them, because every time I absorbed a consequence on her behalf, I was teaching her that consequences could be absorbed. By me. Indefinitely. I had been a good father in all the ways that made me a poor teacher. Maggie, I said. When she comes back in, and she will come back in, because Emily has never been able to stay out of a room where something important is happening, I need you to ask her something. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Ask her what she remembers about Marcus Patterson, I said. Don't explain why. Just ask her. My sister looked at me with the expression she had been giving me since we were children, the one that meant she understood more than I had said, and was reserving judgment on whether I was handling something correctly. All right, she said. From somewhere in the back of the house, I heard a door open. Then Emily's footsteps in the hallway, the particular rhythm of someone who has been crying and is trying to walk in a way that doesn't announce it. She appeared in the doorway of the dining room. Her eyes found me first, then Maggie, then the floor. I owe you an explanation, she said to me. Her voice was rough at the edges. You owe me more than that, I said. But an explanation is a reasonable place to start. Emily stood in the doorway of the dining room, with her arms crossed over her chest. Not defensively, I thought, but in the way of someone trying to hold themselves together from the outside, because the inside wasn't cooperating. Her mascara had tracked down her left cheek in a thin line she hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to wipe away. She was looking at me with the expression of a woman who had prepared several versions of what she wanted to say, and was no longer sure any of them were adequate. Sit down, I said, not unkindly. This is going to take a while. She pulled out the chair nearest the doorway and sat. Maggie stayed where she was, hands around her coffee cup, making herself small, in the way that large presences sometimes do when they understand the room needs space for something else. I looked at my daughter for a moment before I spoke. I was not organizing my thoughts. My thoughts had been organized for 4 years. I was giving myself one last moment to look at her the way I had looked at her before all of this, the way a father looks at a child he loves without condition or calculation. I wanted to hold that for a few more seconds before what came next made it complicated. I need to tell you some things about Daniel, I said. And I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. Can you do that? She nodded. Her jaw was tight. In March of 2014, I said, your husband came to me on a Sunday afternoon and told me his business was going to fail. He had been running the property management company for 18 months, and he had over-leveraged his operating costs against projected revenue that did not materialize on schedule. He needed $340,000 to cover a debt that was coming due in 30 days. Emily's expression shifted. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise exactly. More like the particular discomfort of someone hearing a number they half knew existed, but had never allowed themselves to examine directly. He told you it was a temporary loan, she said. Her voice was careful. He did. He said he would pay it back within 2 years. Did he? He paid back $40,000 over the following 3 years, in installments. The last one arrived in January of 2017. After that, nothing. I kept my voice even. I never asked him about the remaining $300,000. I want you to think about why I didn't ask. She was quiet for a moment. Then softly, because asking would have made it real. Because asking would have required him to acknowledge what he had received. And your husband is not a man who acknowledges receiving things. It disrupts the story he tells about himself. Emily pressed her lips together. She did not argue with that. 2 years later, I continued. In the fall of 2016, Daniel needed capital to expand into a second market. He had identified a commercial district in Murfreesboro he wanted to move into, and the projected costs required a bank loan of $520,000. The bank required a personal guarantor. I paused here because what came next required precision, and I wanted Emily to understand exactly what she was hearing. A personal guarantee, I said, is a legal commitment in which the guarantor, the person signing, agrees to be personally responsible for the debt if the primary borrower cannot pay. It is not a co-signature on a loan. It is a promise that if Daniel failed to meet his obligations, the bank had the right to come after my personal assets directly. My savings accounts, my investment portfolio, the property I owned, everything. Emily's hands had stopped moving in her lap. She was very still. Patricia advised me not to sign it, I said. She laid out every risk in writing and asked me to take 2 weeks to consider it. I signed it the same afternoon Daniel asked me. Why? Emily's voice came out smaller than she intended. I could hear her trying to adjust it and not quite succeeding. Because you were sitting next to him on the couch when he asked. And you looked at me the way you used to look at me when you were small and needed something I had the power to give you. And I told myself that was a reason. I looked at my daughter steadily. It wasn't a reason, Emily. It was a habit. I had spent your whole childhood making problems go away before you had to feel them, and I didn't know how to stop doing it just because you were grown. She closed her eyes. 2 seconds. 3. When she opened them, they were wet again. The guarantee on that loan, I continued, is what Patricia activated tonight. In 2016, at Patricia's insistence, we included a clause in the guarantee agreement that allowed me to withdraw the guarantee with 30 days written notice if I could document a breach of the relationship of trust that formed the basis of the agreement. 30 days ago, I mailed Patricia the triggering letter. Tonight, The 30 days expired. When Daniel's phone rang during dinner, the bank was informing him that his primary line of operating credit, the one secured against my guarantee, had been suspended pending formal recall proceedings. "He doesn't have other lines of credit?" Emily asked. "He has two," I said. "Both of them are undersecured without the guarantee backing them up. His lenders will be notified of the recall within 72 hours. They will almost certainly follow the bank's lead." I let that land. Without the guarantee, Daniel's business does not have the financial structure to support its current operations. He has perhaps 60 days before the practical consequences become severe. Emily was gripping the edge of the dining table with both hands. Her knuckles had gone pale against the wood. "And the house," she said. She said it the way you say the name of something you have been afraid to say out loud. "The house is mine," I said. "It has always been mine. I purchased it in 2018 for $480,000 in cash, and the title has been in my name since the day of closing. Patricia recommended I place it into a revocable living trust at the time of purchase. I did. The trust allows me to manage, transfer, or restructure the property according to my own determination without requiring consent from anyone else." The room was very quiet. From the den, the piano music had stopped. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees along the street, the particular sound Tennessee makes in late November, when the last of the leaves have come down and there is nothing left to muffle the cold. Emily looked at me across the table. Her face had gone through several things in the last 10 minutes and had arrived somewhere that was not quite devastation and not quite understanding, but was moving toward both. "How long have you known," she asked, "that it would come to this?" 4 years, I said. "Since the night your son asked me what a memory care facility was." Emily's breath caught audibly in her throat. "Carter told me," I said. "He didn't know what he was telling me. He came to my room one evening in October of 2023 and asked me very casually if I knew what a memory care facility was, because he had heard his father on the phone talking about moving me somewhere nice." I looked at my daughter steadily. "That was the night I called Patricia and told her to start the clock." Emily sat with that information for almost a full minute. I let her. Some things need room to settle before a person can respond to them honestly, and what I had just told her about Carter was not a small thing. It was the information that reordered everything else, the piece that once placed, showed you what the shape had been all along. "He was 15, she finally said. "He didn't know what he was saying." She says, "I know that. That's why I never held it against him. Carter has been one of the few people in this house who treated me with straightforward decency." I paused. "He used to bring me food, you know. When you and Daniel were out for the evening and whoever was supposed to leave something for me hadn't. He would knock on my door around 7 o'clock with whatever he could find in the refrigerator and sit with me while I ate. He never made a production of it. He just did it." Emily's face did something complicated. The kind of expression that happens when you learn something about your child that makes you proud and ashamed. At the same time, proud because of who they turned out to be, ashamed because of the circumstances that required them to be that way. "I didn't know he was doing that," she said. "No," I said. "You didn't." I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "I want to tell you about Victor." He had trained as a nurse in Nigeria before immigrating, and after arriving in Tennessee, he had completed the American certification process and worked hospital floors for a decade before moving into private home care. He was methodical, unhurried, and constitutionally incapable of saying something he did not mean. He had answered my advertisement in a local home care network, and we had spoken on the phone for 40 minutes before I offered him the position. I knew within the first 10 minutes that he was exactly what I needed. Not because of his credentials, though those were excellent. Because he asked me before I could ask him anything about his availability, or his rates what kind of day I had yesterday. Not how my health was, not what my needs were. What kind of day I had. I hired him on the spot. In the 3 years Victor worked in this house, he arrived every weekday morning at 8 o'clock and stayed until 2 in the afternoon. He managed my medications, assisted with the physical requirements of my mornings, accompanied me to medical appointments, and kept a running log of anything that seemed worth noting. Changes in my energy fluctuations, in my appetite. The small variations that accumulate into a picture of a person's health over time. He texted me updates. He called me on weekends if he was thinking about something he had noticed during the week. He was in every practical sense the person most responsible for the fact that I was still in reasonable health at 68 years old. In 3 years, Victor Okafor met Daniel Marsh 4 times. I want you to understand what I mean when I say 4 times. Not 4 times a week, not 4 times a month, 4 times in 3 years. And on each of those 4 occasions, Daniel had been informed in advance that someone from a local news outlet or a family acquaintance with a social media following was going to be present in the house. Each time Daniel arrived within 30 minutes of the visitor's arrival, shook Victor's hand with the warmth of a man greeting a longtime colleague, and positioned himself near me for the duration of the visit in a way that photographed well. After each visit, he left within 20 minutes of the guest's departure. Victor never said anything about this to me directly. He was too professional and too careful with my dignity to editorialize about my son-in-law's behavior. But one Tuesday afternoon in the fall of 2022, after Daniel had swept through the house for a brief visit, timed to coincide with a neighbor who had a modest but active Instagram following, Victor came into my room after Daniel's car pulled out of the driveway and began straightening items on my desk that did not need straightening. Victor, I said. Say what you're thinking. He stopped what he was doing and turned around. He looked at me with the steady, unhurried expression of a man who has learned to choose his words precisely because imprecision is a luxury caregivers cannot afford. I am thinking, he said, that in 2.5 years, I have never once seen that man enter your room when there was no one else in this house to see him do it. I nodded. I am also thinking, Victor continued, his voice careful and even, that last Thursday when you did not have enough hot water for your shower, because the water heater setting had been turned down again, you did not tell anyone except me. And I am thinking that a man whose family genuinely cared for him would not make that calculation. I had been turning down the water heater setting. Someone in the house had been adjusting it, not dramatically, not enough to constitute an obvious act of negligence, but enough that my mornings had become incrementally more difficult. I had not confronted anyone about it, because I did not have proof of who was doing it, and because by then I was past the point of confrontation. I was in the documentation phase. Thank you, Victor, I said. Write it down. Date, time, and exactly what you observed. He nodded. He pulled the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket, the same pocket I noticed where I kept my phone, and wrote it down before he left the room. Victor kept that notebook for 2 years. When Patricia asked me for supporting documentation beyond the camera footage, I gave her Victor's notebook. 61 entries. Dates, times, precise observations. The record of a man watching another man be slowly and deliberately made invisible in his own home, and writing down what he saw because he understood that witnessed things properly recorded eventually become undeniable. I told Emily all of this at the dining room table while Maggie listened, and the house settled around us into the particular quiet of a party that had ended badly. Emily did not interrupt. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and I watched her face move through things I did not try to name because they were hers to name or not name as she chose. When I finished, she said, I want to talk to Victor. You will, I said. He is going to be at the meeting next week, along with Patricia and everyone else who was at this table tonight. I looked at my daughter steadily. I think it's time this family had an honest conversation, all of it, in the same room. Don't you? Emily looked down at her hands. Then she looked back up at me. Yes, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. I think it is. Emily left around midnight. She did not hug me at the door, and I did not expect her to. We were past the point where gestures of that kind would have meant what they were supposed to mean. She put on her coat in the hallway and paused with her hand on the doorframe and looked back at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in a very long time. It was not remorse exactly. It was something quieter and more permanent than remorse. It was the look of a person who has just understood something they cannot unknow. I'll be at the meeting, she said. I know you will, I said. She left. Maggie stayed and helped me straighten the dining room, moving quietly around the table, collecting glasses and stacking plates without being asked. When we were done, she sat across from me in the kitchen and drank the rest of her coffee cold, and neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with anything that wasn't already there. After she went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in the way houses get after a party has ended. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied out. I sat with my hands on the table, and I let myself go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the evening, the beginning of all of it. It started as most things in my life have started, with Patricia Holt asking me a question I did not want to answer. It was January of 2019. I had called her to discuss some routine matters related to my investment accounts. And at the end of the call, she said, in the careful way she had of saying things she knew would land hard, Richard, how are things at the house? Not how is your health? How are things at the house? I told her things were fine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I had lunch with Barbara Hensley last week. Barbara's daughter is in the same social circle as Emily. Barbara mentioned something that concerned me, and I want to ask you about it directly. Another pause. Is Daniel in the process of consulting with an attorney about your capacity? I remember the exact quality of the silence that followed that question. The way it sat in the room with me. I was in my study at my desk with the phone held against my ear, and outside the window, the January light was coming through the bare trees, in the way it does in winter, thin and precise, illuminating everything without warming anything. Tell me what Barbara said, I told her. Patricia told me. The information was second-hand and incomplete, but the outline was clear enough. Daniel had made inquiries, discreet ones, through a Nashville attorney who specialized in guardianship and conservatorship cases, about the process for having an elderly relative declared legally incapacitated. A guardianship proceeding in Tennessee, Patricia explained, is a legal process in which a court appoints someone to make decisions on behalf of a person deemed unable to manage their own affairs. If granted, the guardian gains legal authority over the subject's financial and personal decisions. The subject loses the right to manage their own assets, sign contracts, or make medical choices without the guardian's consent. In plain terms, if Daniel succeeded, he would control everything I owned. Every account, every asset, the house, my investments, my medical care, all of it would pass through his hands. How certain are you? I asked Patricia. Certain enough to be calling you, she said. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, all right. What do we do? Patricia walked me through it methodically, the way she walked through everything. The first step was documentation. If Daniel intended to build a case that I was losing capacity, I needed to begin building a counter-record immediately evidence of my continued competence, my financial acuity, my consistent decision-making. Medical evaluations, financial transactions, written correspondence. A paper trail that would make a competency challenge extremely difficult to sustain. The second step was the envelopes. Once a month, beginning in February of 2019, I prepared a sealed envelope for Patricia's office. Each envelope contained a dated summary of events in the household, specific incidents, observations, documented irregularities, things I had seen or experienced that spoke to the pattern of behavior Daniel was building toward. Some envelopes contained photographs, some contained printed copies of text messages, some contained nothing more than a handwritten account of a conversation I had witnessed or participated in, signed and dated in my own hand. Patricia kept them in a fireproof filing cabinet in her office, logged by date under the protection of attorney-client privilege. Attorney-client privilege under American law means that communications between a client and their attorney are confidential and legally protected from disclosure. No one, not a spouse, not a family member, not a court absent very specific circumstances, could compel Patricia to reveal what was in those envelopes without my consent. Daniel had tried once through an intermediary to obtain information about the contents. Patricia had declined to respond to the inquiry. That was her legal right and her professional obligation. Then Carter knocked on my door. It was a Wednesday evening, the 11th of October. I remember the date because I had just finished reviewing my quarterly account statements, and the numbers were in better shape than I had expected. Carter knocked twice and came in without waiting, the way he always did, carrying a bowl of leftover chili from dinner that he set on my desk without ceremony. "Hey, Grandpa." He dropped into the chair across from my desk with the loose-limbed ease of a 16-year-old who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about taking up space. "Can I ask you something kind of random?" "You can ask me anything," I said. "What's a memory care facility?" He said it the way teenagers say things casually, as though the question had just occurred to him, and he was not particularly invested in the answer. "Like, I know it's for old people who have memory problems. But is it like a regular nursing home, or is it different?" I set down my pen. "Why are you asking?" He shrugged with the elaborateness of a person trying to look less interested than they are. "I heard Dad on the phone the other day. He was talking to somebody about moving you somewhere nice. He said something about a memory care facility in Clarksville. I just wondered what it was." He looked at me with his mother's eyes, the same direct, slightly uncertain gaze Emily had when she was young, and asking about something she sensed was bigger than the question itself. "Is everything okay, Grandpa?" Clarksville was 45 minutes from Nashville. I knew the facility he was likely referring to. It was a locked-unit memory care residence that charged approximately $7,000 a month and was designed for patients with advanced dementia. I did not have advanced dementia. I did not have early dementia. I had a completely intact mind in a body that did not walk, living in a house I owned, being evaluated for forced removal by a man who had built his entire financial life on my signature. "So everything is going to be okay," I told Carter, and I meant it precisely and completely. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and picked up his phone and sat with me while I finished my statements. He did not know that he had just handed me the only piece of information I had been missing. Not evidence, I had plenty of evidence. A deadline. Daniel was no longer in the research phase. He was moving toward action. I called Patricia the next morning and told her to prepare the triggering letter. 30 days from the date she mailed it, everything would be in motion. She mailed it on the 14th of October. The 30 days expired at midnight on Thanksgiving. I had not chosen the timing. Daniel had. I did not go to bed that night until well past 2 in the morning. Maggie had turned in around and the house had settled into the kind of quiet that feels different from ordinary nighttime quiet. Heavier, more deliberate, as though the rooms themselves were processing what had happened inside them. I sat by the window in my study with the lights off and watched the street outside where the neighbors' houses were dark, and the November wind was moving through the bare oak trees along the sidewalk in long, slow passes. I had been sitting there for about an hour when I realized I had not yet told anyone about what happened in the kitchen before the dinner party started. Not Emily, not Maggie. It had been eclipsed by everything that came after, and I had let it stay eclipsed because the evening had already contained more than enough. But sitting alone in the dark, I found myself going back to it. 30 minutes before Emily called everyone to the table, I had been in the kitchen. I had wheeled myself in to get a glass of water. The kitchen was warm from the oven and smelled of roasting turkey and the rosemary Emily always used in her stuffing, a detail that struck me with unexpected force because it was the same herb her mother had used. And there were moments when the continuity of small domestic things like that felt like the kindest form of inheritance. I had just reached the refrigerator when I heard Daniel come in behind me. I knew it was him before I turned around. I recognized his footsteps, the particular cadence of a man who walks as though he expects the floor to be grateful for the contact. He came in from the hallway and stopped a few feet behind me, and when I turned the chair around, he was leaning against the kitchen island with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that was trying to look casual and not quite succeeding. "I want to talk to you before everyone sits down," he said. "All right," I said. I kept my hands in my lap. I had learned a long time ago that keeping my hands still communicated more composure than anything I could say. Daniel looked at me for a moment with the measuring expression of a man who is trying to determine how much of what he is about to say he actually needs to say. Then he said, "You need to understand something about how things work in this house now." "Tell me how things work," I said. He pushed off from the island and took a few steps toward me. Not threatening exactly, he was too careful for that, too aware of the line between implicit and explicit. But deliberate. He wanted me to feel the reduction of space between us. "This family runs through me and Emily now," he said. "Not through you. Whatever you think your role is here, whatever arrangement you think is still in place, it isn't. You are a guest in this house, Richard, a guest that we have been patient with for a long time." He let that land. "Tonight I need you to sit at the table, eat your dinner, and not make everything about you. Can you do that?" I looked at him steadily. He was 42 years old and wearing a pressed button-down shirt and the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was pleased with how it was going. "You said this family runs through you and Emily," I said. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You're telling me that the decisions about this household, about my life, about where I live and how I'm cared for, those run through you." "That's exactly what I'm telling you, and you feel confident about that?" "Very," he said. There was no hesitation. That was the thing about Daniel. His confidence was never dented by the possibility that he might be wrong. It was one of his most consistent qualities, and his most dangerous one. I nodded slowly. Outside I could hear a car pulling into the driveway. The first guests were arriving. I could hear Emily's voice at the front door, bright and welcoming, shifting into the register she used for company. "Daniel," I said, "how long have you lived in this house?" He frowned slightly. 5 years. "And in 5 years, have you ever looked at the property tax statements, the insurance documents, the mortgage records?" The frown deepened. "The house is paid off. There's no mortgage." "That's right," I said. "There isn't. Because I paid cash for it in 2018, $480,000, and the title as of this moment is in my name and held in irrevocable trust administered by my attorney. I kept my voice exactly level, not aggressive, not raised, not even particularly emphatic, just precise. You are not a co-owner of this property, Daniel. You are not on the deed. You have no legal interest in this house whatsoever. So when you tell me that decisions about this household run through you, I want you to understand that you are describing a situation that does not legally exist. Daniel's face went very still. Furthermore, I continued, the business credit lines that allow your company to operate are currently secured against a personal guarantee bearing my signature. That guarantee is subject to a recall clause that my attorney has had the authority to activate for the past 4 years. I tilted my head slightly. I'm telling you this not to threaten you, Daniel. I'm telling you because you just told me you are confident about your position. I want to make sure that confidence is based on accurate information. He stared at me. For perhaps 5 seconds, he said nothing at all. I watched his jaw work slightly, the way a person's jaw works, when they are running through possible responses and discarding each one as inadequate. You're bluffing, he finally said. His voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Not all of it, but some. That's possible, I said agreeably. You'll know by the end of the evening. From the hallway, Emily called out that dinner was in 20 minutes, and could everyone please come through. Daniel looked at me for one more moment, and then he straightened, and the performance came back up over his face like a curtain being drawn, and he walked out of the kitchen without looking back. I sat alone in the warm kitchen for a moment. The turkey was still in the oven. The rosemary still filled the air. I reached into my cardigan pocket and took out my phone and sent Patricia a single text message. It said, "Tonight. Be ready." Then I put the phone away and wheeled myself toward the dining room and the table my daughter had set for 16 people. And I took my place at the far end near the corner where the wheelchair fit without blocking the walkway. And I waited for Daniel to make his next move. The guests arrived between 5:30 and 6 in the evening. I know the exact window because I had positioned myself near the front hallway and watched them come in not out of sociability, but because I had spent 4 years learning to observe this family carefully, and old habits do not suspend themselves for holidays. They came in 2s and 3s, stomping the cold off their shoes on the front mat, handing coats to Emily, exclaiming over the smell of the turkey and the table decorations and the particular warmth of a house that has been heated for company. There were 16 of us in total. Emily's aunt and uncle from Brentwood, 2 of Daniel's cousins and their spouses, Maggie, who always made the drive from Knoxville for these gatherings and had not missed one in 3 decades, Carter's friend from school, a quiet boy named Russell, who ate everything put in front of him and spoke only when directly addressed, which I respected. And the rest, the assembled collection of people who made up what this family presented to the world as itself. I watched Daniel work the room. He had a particular gift for it. The warm handshake, the remembered detail, the laugh deployed at exactly the right moment. He moved through the gathering with the ease of a man who genuinely believed that rooms improved when he entered them. He refilled drinks without being asked. He clapped shoulders. He drew people into conversations that made them feel temporarily like the most interesting person present. He did not speak to me once during the hour before dinner. Not a greeting. Not a glance in my direction. Not even the performative acknowledgement that people sometimes offer to the person in the room they are ignoring, the quick nod, the brief smile that says "I see you," even as it says nothing else. He moved around me the way water moves around a stone with the practiced ease of long habit, and not one of the 16 people in that room appeared to notice. Maggie noticed. She caught my eye from across the room twice during that hour, and both times her expression said the same thing without words. I see what is happening here. and I am sorry that I have seen it before, and said nothing about it. I gave her a small nod each time. It was enough. We sat down to dinner at 6:45. Emily had arranged the seating with the care she brought to everything she wanted. People to admire the good china, the cloth napkins folded into shapes, the small cards with names written in her careful handwriting. My card was at the far end of the table in the corner, where the wheelchair fit without requiring anyone to adjust their chair. I had not been consulted about the placement. I had simply found my card and taken my position. The first hour of dinner was in the way of these things almost pleasant. The food was good. The wine was flowing. The conversations overlapped and merged and separated the way conversations do when people are comfortable and not yet tired of each other. Daniel told a story about a property deal that had gone sideways in a funny way, and people laughed, and he told it well, as he told most things well, and I sat at my end of the table and ate my turkey and listened. Carter was 3 seats down from me on my left. He caught my eye once during the meal and gave me the small, private smile of someone sharing an understanding they couldn't put into words. I smiled back. He was a good boy. He had always been a good boy in spite of everything around him that might have taught him otherwise. It was during the second hour that Daniel began. He started small. That was his method, always the small move. First, the test of the water. He was telling a story about a neighbor who had recently installed a lift chair in his living room, and he turned it into a joke. And the joke was about the indignities of aging, and it was the kind of joke that lands differently depending on who is in the room, and Daniel knew exactly who was in the room. A few people chuckled. Maggie looked at her plate. I let it go. I had been letting things go at this table for years, and the muscle was well developed. Then Daniel looked directly at me from the far end of the table. Richard, he said. He used my name the way you use a word you are trying to redefine by repetition. How are you finding the chair these days? Comfortable enough? Several people looked at me. Several others looked at their plates. Perfectly comfortable, I said. Thank you for asking, he smiled. It was a smile designed to look warm while delivering something that wasn't. It just seems like it must be limiting. A man like you used to being so active. He paused on the word in a way that gave it a meaning other than its dictionary definition. I did not respond to that. I picked up my water glass and drank from it and set it back down, and I kept my face arranged into the expression of a man who has not heard an insult in what was just said. That was apparently not enough for Daniel, because what came next was not a small move. Emily said something to the table, I do not remember what. Something light, something meant to redirect, and for a moment it seemed as though the evening might find its way back to an ordinary surface. And then Daniel set his fork down with the deliberateness of a man making a decision he has already made, and he looked down the length of the table at me. And the table went quiet in the particular way it does when the person at the head of it decides to speak in earnest. You know what, he said. I think Richard would be more comfortable somewhere with a little more space. Wouldn't you, Richard? He was already pushing back his chair. Let me help you find a better spot. Daniel. Emily's voice carried a note of warning that arrived about 4 seconds too late. He was already behind my chair. His hands found the push handles with the confidence of a man who had thought about this moment, who had, I understood, now rehearsed it. He wheeled me backward from the table smoothly without hesitation and turned the chair toward the hallway with the brisk efficiency of someone relocating an inconvenient piece of furniture. Where exactly are you taking me? I said. Somewhere quieter, he said. You'll thank me. Carter's face as I passed him was the color of someone who has just understood something they cannot unhear. His hands gripped the edge of the table. His mouth opened and then closed again without producing a sound the way mouths do when a person is 15 years too young and 10 years too unprepared for the thing happening in front of them. The storage room door opened. The smell of dust and cardboard reached me. The kitchen light fell across a floor that held nothing comfortable and nothing welcoming, and Daniel's hand reached past my shoulder and found the light switch and did not turn it on. "Stay here," he said, "until the adults are done." The door closed, and in the dark, in the silence, in a room that smelled of the accumulated discards of a family that had been throwing things away for years, I reached into my cardigan pocket and I took out my phone. The screen of my phone cast a pale rectangle of light across the floor of the storage room. It was the only light in there, and it was not much enough to see my own hands. The outline of the boxes stacked against the wall, the recycling bin in the corner, with its smell of old cardboard and something that had once been food. I had been in worse places. I had spent 11 days in a hospital bed learning that my legs were no longer going to be part of my life in the way they had been, and I had not broken then, and I was not going to break in a storage room that smelled of cardboard on Thanksgiving evening. I found Patricia's number. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring the way she always did when it was my number on the screen. Patricia Holt had been my attorney for 23 years, and in 23 years, she had never once let my call go to voicemail when she was available to answer it. It was one of the things I valued most about her, not as a professional courtesy, but as a signal of the kind of person she was. She paid attention to the people she had made commitments to. "Richard," she said. Her voice was steady and alert in the way of someone who has been expecting a call and has been keeping themselves ready for it. "Patricia," I said. "Activate everything." There was a pause. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Not hesitation, Patricia did not hesitate. It was the pause of a professional confirming that she had heard correctly before she committed to an irreversible action. "Understood," she said. "It's done." 2 words. That was all it took. 23 years of trust, 4 years of preparation, 54 sealed envelopes, 61 entries in Victor's notebook, and 3 years of camera footage, all of it distilled into 2 words exchanged in the dark between a man in a storage room and a woman in her home office 40 minutes across town. I ended the call. I set the phone face down on my knee, and I sat in the quiet, and I breathed. Through the door I could hear the dinner party continuing without interruption. Someone was laughing a high, carrying laugh that I recognized as belonging to one of Daniel's cousins, a woman named Brenda, who found most things funnier than they were, and announced her amusement at a volume calibrated for larger rooms than the one she was usually in. I heard the sound of a serving dish being passed. I heard Emily's voice clear and social, saying something I could not make out. I heard the low register of several conversations running simultaneously, the particular acoustic texture of a room full of people who are comfortable and well-fed and not thinking about the man in the storage room. I was not angry about that. I want to be clear about that because people assumed afterward that I must have been, and I was not. Anger requires a degree of surprise, and I had not been surprised by anything that had happened that evening. I had spent 4 years understanding exactly what this family was capable of, and the dinner had confirmed my understanding rather than exceeded it. What I felt sitting in the dark with my phone on my knee was something much quieter than anger. It was the particular stillness that comes when something you have been preparing for a very long time has finally irrevocably begun. I counted the minutes. At 4 minutes and 40 seconds, I heard Daniel's phone ring. His ringtone was set to a sharp, percussive sound, the kind of notification tone that announces itself as important. I heard it cut off when he answered. I heard his voice change, The change in Daniel's voice was not dramatic. It did not crack or rise or take on the quality of obvious distress. It did what confident men's voices do when they receive information they were not prepared for. It tightened. It became more careful, more precise, as though he were suddenly aware that every word he spoke was being evaluated by someone who knew more than he did. "What do you mean, frozen?" I heard him say. A pause. Then his voice tightened further. "That's not possible. I need to speak to someone in authority." Another silence. "Who signed off on this?" I heard him push back his chair. I heard his footsteps cross the dining room floor and move into the kitchen. He was perhaps 8 feet from the storage room door. I could hear him with complete clarity. There has to be a mistake," he said. His voice had dropped into the register men use when they are managing fear in a public setting. "I need you to escalate this. Call your supervisor." This does not just happen without notification. It had happened with notification. The notification had been the triggering letter Patricia mailed on the 14th of October. The bank had received it, processed it, and scheduled the suspension for midnight on Thanksgiving in accordance with the 30-day recall provision. Everything had happened precisely as the contract specified. The only thing that had not happened according to plan was Daniel's assumption that he would be the one controlling the evening. I heard him make a second call. I heard him say Patricia's name the way people say the name of someone they have suddenly realized they should have taken more seriously a long time ago. I heard her assistant tell him she was unavailable. I heard him ask when she would be available and receive an answer that clearly did not satisfy him. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after that. I could hear him breathing. Then I heard him walk back toward the dining room, and I heard his voice drop to the low, urgent register he used with Emily when he did not want other people to hear what he was saying. I heard Emily say, "What, shun," and then say it again differently. The second time, the word carried the particular weight of a person who has just understood that the evening is no longer the evening they thought they were having. Then I heard footsteps approaching the storage room door. They stopped outside it. A long moment passed. Then the door opened slowly, and the kitchen light fell in across the floor and reached my wheels, and Daniel Marsh stood in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in 10 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, and all the accumulated occasions of a family life I had funded without acknowledgement. He looked uncertain, genuinely, completely uncertain. Not the performed uncertainty of a man buying time, but the real kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes and cannot be managed back into composure quickly enough to hide it. "We need to talk," he said. I looked at him from the chair in the dark storage room of the house with my name on the deed. I looked at him steadily without hurry, the way a man looks at someone who has just discovered something that the other man has known for 4 years. "I know," I said. "We do." Then I reached down and took hold of my own wheel rims, and I rolled myself forward out of the storage room through the doorway into the light, without asking Daniel Marsh for anything at all. When I rolled out of that storage room and back into the kitchen, the dinner party had reached the stage of uncomfortable rearrangement. People were moving between the dining room and the den with the purposeful vagueness of guests who sense that something has gone wrong, but have not yet been given official permission to acknowledge it. Conversations had shortened. The wine was being consumed at a pace that suggested people were using it to fill the space where ease used to be. Daniel had disappeared. Emily was standing near the kitchen sink with her arms wrapped around herself, talking to her aunt in a low voice that stopped when I came through the doorway. She looked at me with an expression that contained several things at once, guilt and defiance, and something underneath both of those that I recognized as the particular fear of a person who understands that the version of events they have been maintaining is no longer going to hold. I did not stop to speak to her then. I wheeled through the kitchen and into the hallway and to my study, and I closed the door behind me, and I sat at my desk in the quiet, and I let myself think about what came next. What came next was the meeting. I had known for 4 years that there would be a meeting, a moment, when everything I had documented would need to be presented to the people who had most benefited from pretending it did not exist. I had thought carefully about what that meeting would require. Evidence presented without anger lands differently than evidence presented with it. Anger gives people permission to focus on the anger instead of the evidence. I intended to give no one that permission. I had 3 categories of documentation. The first was financial, the records I had already described to Emily at the dining room table. The second was Victor's notebook. The third was the cameras. I had installed the first camera in August of 2020. It was a small device mounted near the ceiling in the corner of the living room, angled to cover the main seating area and the hallway entrance. I installed it myself on a Tuesday morning when Daniel was at his office and Emily was at her weekly appointment across town, and Victor was the only other person in the house. Victor watched me do it without comment. When I had finished and wheeled back to look at the angle on my phone, he said, "Do you want me to check the blind spots?" I said yes. He spent 20 minutes walking the room and texting me adjustments until the coverage was clean. Over the following 3 years, I added 4 more cameras. One in the kitchen, one in the upstairs hallway outside my bedroom door, one covering the front entrance, one in the small sitting room off the dining room where Daniel took his phone calls when he did not want to be overheard. 5 cameras in total, all wireless, all feeding to a private cloud storage account that only I and Patricia could access. In Tennessee, the law on recording in a private residence is governed by what is called the one-party consent rule. This means that as long as one party to the interaction consents to the recording is legal. I was always a party to any interaction that took place in my own home. Every hour of footage I collected was obtained legally and was fully admissible as evidence in any civil proceeding. In 3 years, the cameras recorded 4,216 hours of footage. I had not reviewed all of it. I had not needed to. Victor's notebook gave me the dates and approximate times of the incidents worth examining, and I had reviewed those segments carefully, frame by frame in some cases, and exported the relevant clips to a labeled folder that Patricia had a copy of and that I had on a drive in my desk drawer. What the cameras showed was not dramatic. That was the important thing about it. There were no confrontations, no obvious cruelties performed for an audience. What there was instead was an absence. Daniel Marsh, across 4,000 hours of footage taken over 3 years, never once entered my bedroom. Never once sat with me in the living room when no visitor was present. Never once brought me a glass of water, a cup of coffee, or a plate of food. He passed through rooms I was in the way people pass through rooms where the television is on, without acknowledgement, without adjustment, as though I were a piece of the background rather than a person occupying the same space. There were 4 exceptions. 4 occasions across 3 years when Daniel entered my room or sat beside me with visible warmth and attention. I had reviewed the timestamps on those 4 clips against Victor's log and cross-referenced them against Emily's social media posting history. In each case, a visitor with an active online presence had been in the house within the previous 2 hours. In 3 of the 4 cases, photographs had been posted to Emily's social media accounts within 90 minutes of the interaction photographs that showed Daniel at my side, hand on my shoulder expression, arranged into something that photographed as devotion. The captions beneath those photographs used words like dedicated and family and gratitude. I had printed those captions and placed them in the 40-second envelope. The social media account was the detail that had required the most patience. I had opened it in the spring of 2021, under a name that bore no resemblance to my own, using an email address I had created for the purpose and accessed only from my personal laptop. The account had no profile photograph and no personal information. It followed a small number of accounts, Emily's, Daniel's, 3 of their mutual acquaintances. It did nothing except observe. I had set up the automated posting schedule in September of 2023, 6 weeks before Carter knocked on my door. The schedule was simple: if I did not log into the account and cancel the queue by midnight, on a date I had selected, a series of posts would go live automatically. The posts contained screenshots of text messages, photographs of bank documents with identifying numbers redacted, and 3 video clips from the camera footage. Each one carefully selected, each one under 90 seconds. Each one showing with complete clarity what 4,000 hours had consistently shown. I had not needed to let them post. The meeting would accomplish what the posts would have accomplished, and it would accomplish it in a room where the people most affected could not click away from it. But I had kept the account active as a contingency, because 4 years of preparation had taught me that contingencies matter. The difference between a plan that works and a plan that almost works is usually one layer of backup that someone thought they did not need. I sat at my desk in my study, and I opened the cloud storage folder, and I looked at the labeled clips for a long moment. Then I opened the automated posting queue, and I looked at the schedule. And then I logged in, and I canceled it. Because what I was going to do in that meeting room would not require a screen. It would only require the truth presented clearly by a man who had been keeping it carefully for 4 years and was finally ready to put it on the table. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet. Outside my study window, the November wind moved through the oak trees with the low, steady sound of something that has been doing what it does for a very long time and intends to continue. I picked up my phone and sent Patricia a second message. It said, "Meeting. First week of December. My house. All of them." She replied in 40 seconds. It said, "I'll bring the envelopes." Patricia arrived at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd of December. She came in through the front door with a leather briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other, and she set both down on the hallway table with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has walked into difficult rooms for 30 years and learned that the rooms go better when you do not rush them. I had arranged the living room the evening before. I moved the coffee table to one side to give the wheelchair clear passage through the center of the space. I placed 12 chairs in a loose arrangement that was neither a circle nor a confrontation. Something in between, something that said, "This is a conversation, not a trial," even though everyone in the room would understand within the first 10 minutes that it was closer to the second thing than the first. I had set a pitcher of water on the side table and 12 glasses because Patricia had told me once that people in difficult meetings drink water constantly without noticing they are doing it and having it available saved interruptions. They came in 1s and 2s between 9 and 9:30. Maggie arrived first before 9 and helped me straighten the last chair without being asked. Then Emily's aunt and uncle from Brentwood. Then 3 of the cousins who had been at the Thanksgiving table. Then Carter, who came alone because I had specifically asked him to attend and specifically told his mother he was included, and who sat in the chair closest to mine with the quiet attentiveness of a young man who understands he is present as a witness to something important. Then Emily, who came in last and sat in the chair furthest from the door, which told me everything about where she was in her own processing of the previous 10 days. Daniel did not come. I had expected that. I had invited him through Patricia formally and in writing, and he had declined through his own attorney, which told me that he had retained one, which told me that he understood the situation more clearly now than he had on Thanksgiving evening. That was fine. The meeting was not for Daniel. Daniel's portion of this had already been handled through the appropriate channels. The meeting was for the family, the people who had been told a story for years and deserved to hear the actual one. Patricia sat to my right. She placed her briefcase on the floor beside her chair and folded her hands on her knee. and looked at the room with the expression of a woman who is present as a professional, not a participant, and who has made that distinction so many times it sits naturally on her face. "Thank you all for coming," I said. My voice was steady. I had decided the night before that I would not begin with an explanation or an apology or any of the framing language people use when they are about to say something difficult and want to cushion it in advance. I would simply begin. I asked you here because this family has been operating on the basis of a version of events that is not accurate, and I think everyone in this room deserves to understand what actually happened and what is actually true. I am going to tell you. Patricia is going to provide documentation for the parts that require it. And then I am going to answer any questions you have. The room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people avoiding something, the attentive quiet of people who have sensed that what is coming is substantial and are making room for it. I started with the money. I laid out the $340,000, the $520,000 guarantee, the $480,000 house, each figure precise, each one supported by a document Patricia produced from the briefcase and passed around the room. I watched people's faces as the numbers moved through the space. Emily's aunt pressed her lips together. One of the cousins leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. Carter sat very still with his hands clasped between his knees, and I could see him doing the arithmetic quietly behind his eyes. Then I talked about Victor. I described his 3 years in the house, his 61 notebook entries, his 4,000 hours of professional attention directed at keeping me functional and informed and treated as a person with a life worth maintaining. I told them that in 3 years, Victor had encountered Daniel in a meaningful way exactly 4 times, and that all 4 times corresponded within hours to social media posts depicting Daniel as an attentive and devoted presence in my life. I nodded to Patricia. She reached into the briefcase and produced a printed copy of those 4 social media posts, with the timestamps visible alongside the corresponding camera footage timestamps from Victor's notebook. She passed them around the room without comment. Maggie looked at the printout for a long moment. Then she looked at Emily. "Is this accurate?" she said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a woman asking a question she already knows the answer to, and is giving the other person one last opportunity to tell the truth voluntarily. Emily looked at the printout in her own hands. Her jaw worked. "Yes," she said. The word came out stripped of everything except its own meaning. The room absorbed that. Then Patricia reached into the briefcase one final time and produced the stack of envelopes. She set them on the coffee table I had moved to the side of the room, and the soft sound they made when they landed was the quietest thing that had happened all morning, and somehow the loudest. "These are sealed monthly records," Patricia said, speaking for the first time since she had introduced herself at the beginning of the meeting. "Each one contains a dated, signed account of events in this household, prepared by Mr. Calloway and delivered to my office under attorney-client privilege. They cover a period of 4 years and 8 months. They have not been opened. Mr. Calloway has instructed me that they will remain sealed unless legal proceedings require otherwise." She paused. "They are here today so that everyone in this room understands that what you have heard this morning is not a recent grievance. It is a documented record." Victor arrived at 10:15 as I had arranged. He came in quietly and took the last remaining chair and looked at the room with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to conceal. I introduced him, simply his name, his role, his years of service. Then I asked him one question. "Victor," I said, "in 3 years of working in this house, how many times did you have a substantive interaction with Daniel Marsh When no visitor or outside party was present, Victor looked at the room. His hands rested open on his knees. He took a breath and answered without hesitation. "Sedno. In 3 years, I have never once had a substantive interaction with Daniel Marsh when no one else was present in this house. I have never once seen him enter Mr. Calloway's room for any reason that was not connected to the presence of an outside visitor." He paused for exactly 1 second. "In 3 years, I have never once seen that man bring Mr. Calloway a glass of water." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when a simple, specific, undeniable fact has just landed in them, and there is nothing left to say that is more powerful than what was just said. Maggie looked at Emily from across the room. She did not ask the question she had been carrying since Thanksgiving. She did not need to. The question had just been answered by a man with 61 notebook entries and 3 years of unhurried professional witnessing, and it had been answered completely. Emily's hands in her lap had gone very still. The room held Victor's answer for a long moment. Nobody moved to fill the space after it. That was the thing about a specific, simple, unambiguous statement of fact. It did not leave room for reinterpretation. People could argue with an opinion or a feeling or a characterization. They could not argue with 3 years and 0. Maggie set her copy of the social media printout down on the arm of her chair. She did not look at it again. She had absorbed what it contained, and she was done with it the way a person is done with a document once the information in it has transferred completely into understanding. She looked across the room at Emily instead, and the look was long and level and full of something that was not anger and not pity, but was somewhere in the difficult territory between the two, where the things we feel about people we love, but cannot protect from themselves, tend to live. "Emily," Maggie said. Her voice was quiet, not gentle exactly. Maggie's voice was rarely gentle in the way people use that word to mean soft or yielding, but it was careful. The careful voice of a woman choosing each word the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as a real question. Not an accusation. A question." Emily looked at her aunt. Her face had the particular quality of someone who has been bracing for impact, long enough that the bracing itself has become exhausting. Her hands were still in her lap. Her shoulders had the set of a person who is holding themselves upright through an act of sustained will rather than any natural ease. "Do you remember the summer you were 9? Maggie said. "The Pattersons' boy. Marcus." Something moved across Emily's face. It was quick, the kind of involuntary response that happens before a person's management of their own expression can intervene. Her eyes changed. Then her jaw tightened, and the management came back up, and she looked at her hands. "I remember," she said. "Tell me what you remember," Maggie said. A long pause. Around the room, people were very still, not with the stillness of discomfort, but with the attentive stillness of people who understand they are present at something that matters and have the decency to be quiet for it. "He said something about Dad's truck," Emily said. Her voice was low. "He was making fun of it, in front of his friends." "And what did you do?" Emily's throat moved. "I went after him." "You were 9 years old," Maggie said. "He was 11, bigger than you by a head. And you got off that porch, and you went straight at him without stopping to think about it for 1 second. Maggie's voice did not waver. "You shoved him hard enough that he stumbled back into his friends, and you told him," she paused. "Do you remember what you told him?" For a moment, Emily did not answer. The room waited. Carter in the chair beside mine had his eyes on his mother with an expression I recognized as the look of a young person discovering that their parent was once a different version of themselves, a version that contained possibilities the current one seemed to have set aside. "I told him not to talk about my dad like that," Emily said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I said my dad was worth more than his whole street." "Yes," Maggie said. "That's what you said." She let a beat of silence fall, not an empty silence but a weighted one, the kind that holds a question before it is asked. "Where did that little girl go, Emily?" The question landed in the room the way certain questions do not, with the force of an accusation, but with something quieter and more penetrating. It did not ask Emily to defend herself. It did not ask her to explain or justify or account for the distance between who she had been and who she had become. It simply named the distance. And in naming it, it made the distance real in a way that all the bank documents and camera timestamps and sealed envelopes had not quite managed to make it. Emily stood up. She did not storm out. She did not cry loudly or push past anyone or make the kind of exit that announces itself as a performance. She simply stood, and her chair scraped back slightly against the floor, and she walked out of the living room through the kitchen door with the careful, measured steps of a person who is concentrating very hard on not falling apart in a room full of witnesses. The kitchen door did not slam. It closed quietly behind her. The room breathed. Carter watched his mother go. His hands were braced on his knees and his jaw was set with the particular tension of a 16-year-old trying to hold his face in a configuration that does not reveal everything he is feeling. He looked at me after a moment, and what was in his eyes was complicated love for his mother and sorrow for her, and a kind of grief for the grandfather he had spent years bringing chili bowls to on Tuesday evenings, and the slow, uncomfortable understanding of a young person realizing that the adults in their life have been carrying things they were never told about. "Is she going to be okay?" he said. He asked it quietly, pitched only to me. "Yes," I said. "But it's going to take some time." He nodded. He accepted that the way he accepted most things without drama, with the steady, practical grace that had always made him the most straightforward person in a household that ran on indirection. Victor sat with his hands open on his knees and looked at the floor in the way of someone who has said everything he came to say and is now simply being present, which is its own form of support and requires its own kind of steadiness to sustain. Patricia made a note on the legal pad she had kept in her lap throughout the meeting. She did not look it up when she wrote it. Whatever she was noting, she kept to herself, as she kept most things not out of secrecy, but out of the professional understanding that some things are recorded and some things are witnessed. And the difference between the two is not always immediately obvious, but is always important. Maggie picked up her coffee cup. It had gone cold. She drank from it anyway, the way she had drunk cold coffee the night before in my kitchen, after everyone else had gone, because Maggie Calloway had never in her life required conditions to be comfortable before she did what she intended to do. I looked at the kitchen door Emily had gone through. I gave her 20 minutes. Then I wheeled myself to the kitchen door and pushed it open, and went to find my daughter because there were things that still needed to be said between us, that no document and no witness and no meeting room could say on my behalf. She was not in the kitchen. I pushed through the kitchen door, and the room was empty, the coffee maker still running a half-filled cup on the counter that had stopped steaming, a chair pulled slightly away from the kitchen table, as though someone had sat in it briefly and then changed their mind. I moved through the kitchen and into the hallway and down toward the back of the house, and I found her where I had expected to find her, though I had not said so to anyone. She was in my room. The door was open. She was sitting on the floor beside my desk, not in the chair, not on the edge of the bed, but on the floor. The way people sometimes sit when the furniture available to them feels like too much of a commitment to a position they are not sure they have earned. She was sitting with her back against the side of the desk, and her knees drawn up and the wooden box in her hands. She had not opened it yet. She was holding it the way you hold something when you are not sure you are ready for what is inside it, but you are also past the point of being able to put it down. I came through the doorway and stopped just inside the room. I did not go to the desk or to the bed. I positioned the chair where I could see her face and stayed there, and I let her know I was present without making my presence into a demand. She looked up at me. Her eyes were dry, which told me she had been doing the harder kind of crying, the kind that has already moved through tears and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. I found it when I was looking for something else, she said. A few days after the meeting, I came in here looking for, I don't know what I was looking for. She looked back down at the box. I found this instead. I know, I said. I left it where you would find it. She looked up at me again, and something shifted in her expression. The slow, recalibrating shift of a person who has just understood that what they thought was an accident was not. You wanted me to find it, she said. Yes. She looked at the box for a long moment. Then she pressed the small brass latch on the front with her thumb and lifted the lid. I had put 3 things in that box over the years. The first was the medical report from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, dated the 22nd of November, 2008, the formal documentation of my injuries from the night of the accident. It was 12 pages long, dense with clinical language, and on the 3rd page it contained a single sentence that I had read more times than I could count in the 15 years since patient sustained spinal injury consistent with shielding impact, indicating deliberate interposition between point of force and secondary occupant. The name of the secondary occupant was listed on the intake form attached at the back. Emily Renee Calloway. She picked up the report carefully, the way you pick up something old. She read the cover page. She turned to the 3rd page. I watched her find the sentence. I watched her read it twice. She did not make a sound, but her hands holding the paper began to tremble, a fine, steady tremor that started in her fingers and moved up through her wrists, the kind of physical response that happens when the body receives information the mind has been refusing to process for a very long time. The second thing in the box was a letter. It was written on 3 sheets of notebook paper in blue ink in the handwriting of a 10-year-old, large, careful letters that pressed hard into the page, the way children's writing does when they are concentrating with their whole self on getting the shapes right. It was dated March 15, 2001, 7 years before the accident, written for a Father's Day card project Emily's 4th grade class had done. Her teacher had asked each student to write a letter to someone they admired. Emily had written to me. The letter said, among other things, Dad, so you are the bravest man I know. You work hard every day and you never complain about anything. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. I will always protect you the way you protect me. That is my promise. Emily set the medical report down on the floor beside her and picked up the letter. She read it once. Then she pressed it flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes, and her shoulders drew in and forward, and the sound she made was small and broken and entirely without performance. The sound of a person who has just come face to face with the full distance between who they promised to be and who they became, and found that distance unbearable. I did not move toward her. I did not tell her it was all right, because it was not all right, and she did not need comfort that required dishonesty to deliver. What she needed was to feel it completely without anyone rushing her through it or softening the edges of it, because this was the feeling that everything else had been organized around avoiding for 15 years, and the only way through it was through it. She stayed like that for a while. The letter pressed to her chest. Her eyes closed. The trembling in her hands gradually slowed and steadied the way trembling does when the body begins to accept what the mind is finally letting in. When she opened her eyes, they were wet but steady. She looked at me across the room with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was very young. Stripped of management, stripped of performance, stripped of the careful social architecture she had built around herself over the years. Just her face. Just Emily, the one who had written the letter. "There's something else in the box," I said quietly. She looked down. At the bottom of the box, beneath where the letter had been, was a small USB drive. Black, unmarked, the size of a thumb. She picked it up and looked at it. "What is this?" "Your mother's voice," I said. Emily's breath caught in the way breath catches when a name arrives without warning, the involuntary contraction of grief that never fully domesticates itself, no matter how many years pass. She looked at the drive in her palm. Her fingers closed around it slowly. She recorded something. Emily's voice was barely a sound. "3 months before she passed," I said. "She asked me to keep it until I thought the time was right." I looked at my daughter steadily. "I think the time is right." Emily looked at the small black drive in her closed hand for a long time. Then she looked up, and what was in her eyes was the complicated mixture of grief and fear and longing that belongs specifically to people who are about to hear the voice of someone they loved and lost, and are not sure they are ready for how much it is going to cost them. "Will you stay?" she said. "While I listen?" "Yes," I said. "I'll stay." Before I reveal the emotional truth inside this recording, comment 15 or stay below so I know you're still here with me. And please note, the following part of the story includes fictional dramatizations and may not be entirely factual. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to turn off the video right now. Emily's laptop was on my desk. She reached up from the floor and pulled it down to her lap without standing, and she sat there with it open on her knees, and she looked at the USB drive in her palm for a moment longer before she plugged it in. There was one file on the drive, a single audio file 41 minutes and 17 seconds long, labeled in Margaret's handwriting, converted to a file name the way people sometimes do when they are not entirely comfortable with technology, but want to leave something that will last. The file was called simply "For Emily, When the Time is Right." Emily looked at the file name on the screen. Her throat moved. Then she pressed play. Margaret Calloway's voice filled my study. She had recorded it in the spring of 2015, 3 months before she passed. I had been there when she recorded it, sitting in the chair beside the bed in the room we had shared for 31 years, watching her speak into the small digital recorder our son-in-law had given her for Christmas 2 years earlier, and that she had used exactly twice before this occasion. Her voice on the recording was not the voice of the last weeks thinned by exhaustion and medication. It was the voice of the woman I had known, clear and measured, with the slight Tennessee cadence that had never left her. No matter how many years she spent trying to speak like someone from nowhere in particular. She began with Emily's childhood. She talked about the morning Emily was born, a Tuesday in April, early before the sun was fully up, and the way the light came through the hospital window and fell across the blanket they had wrapped her in. She talked about Emily at 4 years old, insisting on carrying her own backpack on the first day of preschool, even though it was almost as large as she was. She talked about Emily at 12 learning to drive a riding lawnmower in their backyard and taking out 2 sections of the fence on the east side before bringing it to a stop against the garden shed, and how Richard had stood on the back porch, watching the whole thing with his hand over his mouth so Emily would not see him laughing. Emily on the floor of my study was smiling at that. A real smile, the involuntary kind that arrives before grief can stop it. The kind that happens when a memory is genuinely funny and the love inside it is strong enough to surface even through everything else that is present in the room. Then Margaret's voice changed. Not dramatically, Not the way a voice changes when a person steels themselves for something difficult. It changed the way a voice changes when a person moves from speaking generally to speaking specifically, a small tightening, a gathering of intention. She said, "Emily, there is something I need to tell you, and I need you to hear it without letting it become something you carry as a burden, because that is not what it is meant to be. It is meant to be the truth, and the truth is not always a burden. Sometimes it is the thing that finally sets the weight down." Emily had stopped smiling. She was very still. "Your father has never told anyone what happened the night of the accident. Not the doctors beyond what they needed to know to treat him. Not the police who wrote their report and moved on. Not his sister. Not me, not fully, not until the night before they moved him out of the ICU when he was frightened enough that the things he had been holding came loose. He told me that you were driving. He told me that the road was wet and that it happened fast, and that there was nothing you could have done differently. He told me that before the car came to rest, he had one clear thought, and the thought was that you were on the wrong side of the impact, and he needed to change that. He made me promise not to tell you." Emily's hand came up to her mouth. "I want you to understand what I mean when I say he made me promise. He did not ask me. He was lying in a hospital bed with a spinal injury that had just ended his ability to walk, and he looked at me with complete clarity, and he said, 'Margaret, Emily cannot know that I did this on purpose. She will spend her whole life trying to pay it back, and I don't want that for her. I want her to have a life that belongs to her. Not one organized around a debt she didn't ask to carry.' I promised him. I kept that promise for 7 years." Margaret paused on the recording. I heard her take a breath, a long one, the kind that precedes something that has been held for a long time. "But Emily," she continued, "I am telling you now because your father is too good a man to tell you himself, and because I think you need to know, not so that you feel guilty, but so that you understand who he is. What he did that night was not an accident, and it was not instinct. It was a choice. In the time it takes to draw one breath, your father chose you. And he has never not for one single day asked you to carry the cost of that choice." I watched Emily on the floor of my study. She was not crying the way she had cried before, the compressed, managed grief of someone maintaining the edges of their composure. She was crying the way people cry when the last wall comes down, with her whole face, with her shoulders, with the full weight of 15 years of not knowing a thing that had been true every single day of those 15 years. I did not move toward her. I had learned in a lifetime of loving this person that there are moments when presence is enough and intervention is too much. I sat in my chair, and I let her hear her mother's voice, and I let the room hold what it needed to hold. Margaret's voice continued for another 22 minutes. She talked about other things, small things, family things, the kind of details a mother preserves, because she understands that the small things are what people reach for first when someone is gone. The recipe for the apple cake she made every October, the location of a box of photographs in the hall closet that she was not sure anyone knew about, a story about Richard from the early years of their marriage that made him laugh even now alone in his study 15 years after the morning she died. But it was the middle section that mattered, the section about the accident, the section about the promise. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was the full and complete silence of a room in which something significant has just finished happening. Emily sat with the laptop open on her knees and the audio program showing the waveform frozen at 41 minutes and 17 seconds, and she breathed, and I breathed. And outside the window, the December light came through the bare trees, the way it always did in this city in this month, thin and clear and without pretense. After a long while, Emily looked up at me. Her face was open in a way I had not seen it in many years. not the managed openness of a person presenting a version of themselves. The real kind, the undefended kind. "He never wanted me to know," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "No," I said, "because he didn't want me to spend my life paying it back." "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said in a voice that was not asking for forgiveness, but was beginning carefully and with great difficulty to ask for something, for understanding perhaps, or for a door left open, or for the chance to become again the person who had written the letter at the bottom of the wooden box. "Dad," she said, "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at my daughter, at the face I had known since before she could speak, at the eyes that were her mother's, and the set of the jaw that was mine, and the expression that was entirely her own, complicated and raw, and underneath everything else genuinely asking. "You don't fix it all at once," I said. "You just start." Daniel's attorney called Patricia the morning after the family meeting. His name was Gerald Foss, a downtown Nashville practiced business litigation and family disputes. Patricia described him as thorough and realistic. Realistic in legal terms means he understood when a client's position was not strong and was willing to say so. He told Daniel so. Patricia summarized the conversation in approximately 2 minutes. Daniel was prepared to discuss a settlement arrangement regarding the personal guarantee recall and the credit suspension. He was willing to acknowledge certain financial obligations in exchange for a restoration of his credit lines. Patricia asked me how I wanted to respond. I told her there was nothing to negotiate. The personal guarantee recall stood. The credit suspension remained in effect. The house remained in the trust. Daniel had built 10 years of professional life on the foundation of my signature, and the foundation had been withdrawn. That was not a situation that could be renegotiated into something comfortable without undoing the only thing that had made it uncomfortable in the first place, which was the truth. Daniel left the house on the 19th of December. I know the date because Carter texted me at 9:17 that morning. The message said, "He's gone. Took his car and 2 bags. Mom is downstairs. I thought you should know." I replied with 3 words. "Thank you, Carter." He did not reply, but the read receipt appeared within seconds. That evening, Emily knocked on my study door. She had not knocked in years. She sat across from my desk and looked at me with the face of someone who had been doing the hardest kind of internal work and carried it only in her eyes and the set of her shoulders. "I am not going to ask you to forgive me tonight," she said. "I don't think I've earned it yet. I just want you to know that I understand what I've been doing, and I intend to do differently." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. "Okay, that's enough for tonight," I said. "That's more than enough." She stood and pushed the chair back carefully, the way a person does when they have recently been reminded that small things matter. At the door she paused. "Those envelopes," she said. "What's in them?" "Everything," I said. 4 years and 8 months. Everything I observed and documented. I looked at her steadily. "I kept them because I was hoping I would never have to show any of it. I was hoping to wake up one morning and find that the family I had was the family I thought I was building." She stood with that for a moment. Then she said good night. I listened to her footsteps until they faded. Then I sat in the quiet and thought about whether I believed her when she said she intended to do differently. I decided that I did. Not completely, not without reservation, but enough to leave the door open. And sometimes in the particular arithmetic of family, enough is where everything begins. It was the 3rd of January when Emily came to me and said she was ready to talk. Not the kind of talking we had been doing, the careful, provisional exchanges of 2 people testing the ground between them. The real kind. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where we used to do her homework when she was small, and she put her hands flat on the surface the way she did when she was a child and meant something completely. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the answer is hard." "All right," I said. "Did the wheelchair ever make you hate me?" The question landed in the kitchen, the way her mother's voice had landed in my study, with the full weight of something that had been held for a very long time before it was finally said out loud. I did not answer immediately. Not because I was uncertain, but because the question deserved the respect of a considered response rather than a reflexive one. "No," I said. "Not for one day. Not for 1 hour." Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and held it. "I made a choice that night," I said. "It was my choice to make, and I made it freely, and I have never regretted it. The wheelchair is not a punishment, Emily. It is not something that was done to me. It is the shape my life took after a decision I would make again tomorrow if the same road came around twice." She was crying now, quietly, steadily, the way people cry when they are not performing grief, but simply having it. "See, I wasted 15 years, she said. "I wasted them being afraid of what I owed you, and instead of facing it, I turned it into resentment, and I aimed that resentment at you, and you sat there and absorbed it because that is who you are." Her voice broke on the last words and came back. "I don't know how you did that." "Because you are my daughter," I said. "Before you are anything else, you are my daughter. And a father's job is to carry the things his children cannot carry yet. I was waiting for you to be ready to carry this one." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm. I turned my palm up and held it. We sat like that for a while. The January light came through the kitchen window in the thin, clear way of winter mornings, and the coffee maker ran its cycle, and the house held us the way houses do when the people inside them are finally telling each other the truth. I forgive you, Emily," I said. "I want you to hear that clearly, not as a transaction, not as a condition. I forgive you because you are worth forgiving, and because carrying the alternative would cost me more than I am willing to pay." I looked at her steadily. "But forgiveness is not a return ticket. We do not go back to what we were. We build something from here, from this table, from today. And we build it honestly this time." She nodded. She did not ask for more than that, because she understood finally that what had just been offered was not a small thing. It was everything she had actually needed, and nothing she had not earned. "Okay," she said. "From here." "From here," I said. Spring came to Nashville in the last week of March. The dogwoods bloomed early that year, white and pale pink along the street outside my window. The kind of blooming that feels like an argument against everything winter insisted was permanent. Carter came by on a Saturday morning with coffee and no particular agenda, which was the best kind of visit. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and we talked about his plans for the following year, college applications, a summer job. He was considering the particular uncertainty of being 16 and understanding that the world was larger than the one you had grown up inside. He talked easily, the way he always had with me, without the careful management that characterized most conversations in this house for most of the years I had lived in it. When he left, I wheeled myself to the window in the front room. It was the window Daniel had once stood beside when he told me to stay out of the way. The window he had positioned himself in front of when he wanted to remind me, without saying it directly, that the light and the view and the space all belonged to him. I sat in the April sun and felt it come through the glass and rest on my hands and my forearms and the wheels of the chair that had carried me for 15 years through everything this family had managed to become. Emily had asked me once, in the weeks after our kitchen table conversation, whether I thought the chair had cost me more than it gave me. I had thought about it for a moment. Then I said, it gave me the window. It gave me the patience to wait until the truth was ready to be told. It gave me 15 years of understanding exactly who the people around me were, and the time to decide what to do about it. She had nodded slowly. She was still learning what it meant to sit with an answer that did not resolve into something simple. Outside, the dogwoods moved in a light wind. I was not waiting for anything. I was not managing anything. I was not confirming a pickup or monitoring a medication or reviewing a document or preparing a sealed envelope for Patricia's office. I was sitting in my own home at my own window in the full and uncomplicated sun of an early Tennessee spring. They told me to sit down and stay out of the way. I did sit down. I have been sitting down for 15 years, but this window is mine. This house is mine. This light falling across these hands on this particular Saturday morning in the spring of 2024, this is mine. And for the first time in a very long time, there is no one in this room who would tell me otherwise. Do not wait until the storage room to understand your own worth. I waited too long. I kept paying into accounts that were never going to balance. I told myself that patience was the same as wisdom, and sometimes it was. But sometimes it was just fear wearing a quieter name. If you are carrying this family the way I carried mine, put it down. Not out of bitterness, out of honesty. God did not build you to be invisible in your own home. This grandpa's stories is not just mine. I hear it in every family story about a parent who gave everything and received silence in return. If any part of this grandpa's stories reached you, if you recognized someone at that Thanksgiving table or someone sitting alone in a room they were pushed into, then this family story was worth telling. And if you know someone living inside a grandpa stories like this one, share it with them. Sometimes the right words find people exactly when they need them. Leave a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you. Subscribe so you never miss another family story that matters. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements, created purely to entertain and inspire. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, find what speaks to your heart. But if you are staying, I am glad you are here.